Well, great. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. My plan is to speak for about 12 minutes and then take Q&A. And the topic today is the indictment of 5 Chinese military officers, members of the People's Liberation Army, by the U.S. Department of Justice about 3 weeks ago now. What I want to do is first set a little bit of the background, explain what's been happening between China and the United States over the last several years, then talk a little bit about the indictment itself and its structure, and then what it may mean for the future going forward. Background. Over the last 5 to 7 years, the United States has been on the receiving end of an almost unending assault from China in the form of cyber espionage, the theft of intellectual property and national security secrets has been rampant and almost beyond measure. A few examples that are merely signposts of any number of others that we could name. Back in the 2009-2010 timeframe, there was a operation that we have given the code name Night Dragon that involved the systematic theft of bidding documents from U.S. oil interests, oil and gas companies, who were in bidding competition with the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company for offshore oil leases. They lost that competition, unsurprisingly, because we later came to believe that the bidding documents had been disclosed to the Chinese the confidential business information of the U.S. oil companies had been disclosed long before the bids had been filed and sealed. That's a perfectly good example of a commercial assault of the form that we've seen. And I would say, just parenthetically, that it certainly is not limited to major U.S. corporations. I personally have seen the theft well, I personally haven't seen it, but I've personally become aware of the theft of confidential business information from a small furniture company in the middle of the country whose intellectual property was the sophisticated designs that it used for its furniture, which were lost, stolen, and within a year, knockoffs were coming across from China and getting off the boat in Seattle and selling for half the price. Company went out of business, 50 Americans out of work. Not a big company, not who you would think would be a target, so the targeting in the commercial sphere is not limited to large institutions. Of course, the targeting is also not limited to commercial institutions. There's been a significant, indeed almost consistent effort to penetrate our national security interests as well. Last year, the Defense Science Board conducted a classified review of the programs that had been penetrated by the Chinese, and the only reason I know about it is because it was, of course, on the front page of the Washington Post within a few weeks of having been issued. Nonetheless, we can refer to that as the report. The Post says that the report says that more than 50 different weapons systems and programs lost significant intellectual property to the Chinese, ranging from the designs for the F-35 fighter and the RC-135 to the encryption technology that runs the UAV videos of the drones over Afghanistan and Pakistan, to the identification friend or foe communication systems that we run, as well as all sorts of sophisticated projects. One went by the name of nanostructured metal technology, and I don't even know what that is. But it sounds kind of cool, and I'm glad we have it, and I'm really annoyed that we lost it. Last year, 2013, the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property estimated that the overall gross loss to the United States in intellectual property was $300 billion a year. Let me say that again, $300 billion a year. Now, just the other day, the Center for Strategic and International Studies released a different estimate. They think that that's a little high. Their lowball estimate of loss of American intellectual property is on the order of $100 billion a year. So I suppose in some way that's good news. Up until recently, we have done nothing about that. I mean, quite literally, almost nothing except complain to the Chinese and say to them, you must stop. Pleas that have, according to public reports, fallen on deaf ears. The press has reported that then National Security Advisor Tom Donilon led a delegation to Beijing with a dossier of essentially forensic evidence against Chinese military officials who were engaged in this sort of espionage, to which the Chinese said, nah, not doing nothing about it. Which brings us to where we are today, a time in which up until now, I would say that our government has been painfully supine in its response to Chinese espionage. Whether or not these indictments are a blip, a tactical change, or part of a broader strategy that we might in this room actually approve of, remains to be seen. They are clearly the first move in a chess game. If there are no other moves, then it's a wasted move. If there are moves that come later, then that's actually something that I, at least, am willing to get behind and support. But the jury is out. So what is the indictment? Well, it's an indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, as I said, for what I would characterize as plain vanilla violations of domestic American law. There's a law, the Computer Fraud Abuse Act, that makes it a crime to intrude upon somebody else's computer without their permission or authorization. It's essentially, you can't trespass on a computer. This is the type of charge we use all the time in standard cyber theft cases across the country. It has been deployed against the Chinese. So, fair characterization, none of these charges were extreme. None of these charges were ones that kind of stretched the legal envelope as American domestic law would take it. There were, for example, no charges that the People's Liberation Army is a racketeering organization, though we could have done that, something like that. Instead, simple charges. The reality, though, of course, is that these 5 officers are never going to see the inside of an American courtroom, right? China is not going to extradite them. We don't even have an extradition treaty generally, and even if we did, China would not be sending 5 military officers to the American courts for a criminal trial. So then what is the point of the indictment if we don't realistically expect them to be tried? And let's be fair, I'm quite certain that the Obama administration does not actually expect them to ever be presented for trial. They have to say that they do, because you can't say that you think that criminal law is a joke in public, but they don't really. So what's the purpose? It must be that it's a signaling event. It's a way of sending a signal. Who are the audience for this signal? Well, there are several. The first, of course, is the Chinese. Sends 2 signals to them. One signal is, we're getting annoyed, we really are peeved, and we're going to start saying so publicly. The second one, which is a bit more sophisticated and I think a more likely real purpose of this, is we know what you're doing. If you read the indictments, they are very detailed forensic expositions of precisely how the Chinese military is carrying out its cyber attacks, identifying IP addresses, passwords, usernames, individuals by name who are tracked through their tradecraft or their computer craft. So it's very much a disclosure to the Chinese of a fair amount of our back-figuring of what they've done, which must, I think, have hurt quite a bit for the U.S. government, because it discloses very clearly the extent to which we understand what they're doing, and will obviously result in the Chinese changing some of their tactics. But nonetheless, it was a very effective method of saying, we're inside your systems, and we're smarter than you think we are, and we're probably smarter than you are, which is a useful message to send. It's a signaling event to U.S. corporations, people in the who run ISPs and whose intellectual property have been stolen, like the victims in this case, U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, Alcoa, are now happily getting the message that the U.S. government is willing to at least suffer some, stand up publicly and suffer some disbenefit in terms of our relationships with China in defense of them. So that's a good message. It's a message, I think, happily, to the rest of the world, our allies and enemies. One, the same message that we send to the U.S. governments that we're going to actually do something about, but also, for me at least, hopefully a message that we're kind of coming out of the post-Snowden crouch of defensive, we're sorry, we didn't mean to do it sort of thing, and actually stepping back onto the stage and being willing to assert ourselves somewhat in this domain without fear of being called revanchists, NSAists across the cyber domain. So those are the signals it sends, but that by itself would, I think, not be enough to have warranted bringing this indictment. The indictment is only of value if it's followed on with something more. So what would some of the something more be? Well, the thing that I'm looking for that I would suggest is what I hope is in the strategy going forward is the beneficiaries of the Chinese intellectual property theft. If you read the indictment, it makes it very clear that a bunch of state-owned enterprises have benefited from receiving American intellectual property through the activities of the charged members of the People's Liberation Army. So there are Chinese corporations who are, in effect, receiving stolen property. They're not named in the indictment, but I have a strong suspicion that they're known. And if it were me, that would be the next sort of target that I would be thinking about addressing. Those are companies that have global presences. They are not limited to being inside of China. They are capable of being addressed. They have assets in the United States. They have assets in Europe. They have executive officials who want to travel internationally, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the pressure points that we might come on, a law enforcement pressure point. In addition, this also sets the stage, if we're not going to, even if we're not going to indict them, for things like countervailing duties and tariffs on the goods manufactured by these profiteering Chinese corporations that we can allege are beneficiaries of illegally received intellectual property. That, too, would be something on the to-come list that we may or we may not see going forward. In essence, I would say, and I'll close with this, that this could be the first step in a broad brush campaign that involves information, diplomacy, law enforcement, financial, economic factors, or it could be just a meaningless step that does nothing and gets us nowhere. I am hopeful that it's the former. I am a bit skeptical and a bit concerned that it might be the latter. And the only fair answer is call me back in 6 months and we'll see. And with that, I'll take questions. Hey, Ariel. Sir. They want you to have that microphone so that you're on the system. Da 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 da. There we go.
I served on Capitol Hill as the chief of staff last time to a member of the Intel Committee. And we were told quite regularly that the Chinese were hacking into congressional computers and to be very careful about what we put out on there and to toughen our security practices in the office and in our committees, etc. But no mention's been made of that in the indictment of the 5.
That's true. I'm not sure that we would want to really publicly disclose how weak the cyber systems are in Congress, nor, frankly, in the federal government. We've done a study at Heritage that we update regularly. I think we're up to 75 or 80 very significant breaches of federal cyber systems, some of which are pure criminal ones from Russia or Ukraine and are not attributable to the Chinese because they're just after personal information, that credit card numbers, things like that. Others of which are quite clearly foreign intelligence based expeditions into the DoD systems, DHS systems, things like that. Because we're relying on open source at Heritage, I couldn't tell you which of those were Chinese vice Russian, vice French, vice German, vice Israeli. But it is absolutely clear that, well, I'll put it this way. There is absolutely no evidence that federal systems are more secure than private sector systems.
So if we pursue the policy you say and designate some Chinese companies for tariffs, for example, or to disallow their exports to us based on this cyber hacking, do the Chinese have a case with the World Trade Organization based on the agreements we've signed? Is that considered an arbitrary act by the United States? Or do we have to actually bring criminal charges and then only do it in the context of a court order?
That's a great question, and I will preface my answer by saying I am not a WTO expert guy, but the way it has been explained to me is that we actually have a case in the WTO right now, because assuming the truth of the matter asserted that the Chinese are systematically stealing intellectual property, that puts them in breach of their obligations under the WTO and also under the International Convention on the Protection of Intellectual Property, to which they're also a signatory. My understanding to the main point of your question is that you are entitled to impose duties to the extent that your importer, the person who's exporting to you, is engaging in what we would essentially characterize as unfair business practices. And we don't have to have proven that in a criminal case to issue a countervailing duty. We would, of course, be subject to a challenge, at which we would have to make a proof of case about why it is we've targeted the chips from Huawei, for example, and potentially have to lay out the basis for it in front of some neutral international tribunal. I sort of think we'd actually, the cost to us of doing that is much more in the disclosure of sources and methods than in anything else, but the benefit to us of doing that in a form that actually is more of a public, shaming of the Chinese, and it would probably be quite high. So I think we'd probably welcome that in the end.
Any other questions? I might ask one then myself, if I might. You've talked mostly here about commercial and economic espionage by China, but it seems to me that at least an equal threat coming from the Chinese is the one that you alluded to, at least, and that's military, or their ability to strike against our critical infrastructures. Might you say a word or two about their ability to hack into our critical infrastructures and do harm there?
That's a great question. I'm a bit of an iconoclast in my own views on that, so I'll give you the A answer, and then I'll give you my answer. The A answer, which is, and as far as it goes, it's absolutely correct, is that there are systematic vulnerabilities in a lot of our critical infrastructure, many of which are operated using SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems, which time and again have been proven to be vulnerable. That the degree of vulnerability is highly variable. It's much less in some of the financial industry, for example. It's pretty significant in the electric industry. It's very high in the transportation industry. It's the chemical industry is kind of also, so each one is variable, and within an industry it's highly variable. The big banks are good. The small banks in the middle of the Midwest have invested a lot less. So that goes without saying. And some of those vulnerabilities are highly consequential. The loss of an electric grid in Los Angeles. I actually saw a Chinese academic study that was published in English to their great regret by two guys named Wang and Rong about how the systems were sufficiently integrated that a single flaw could cause a cascading electric grid failure in the West Coast. So the vulnerability is very real. To my mind, however, the likelihood of that being exercised by China is relatively small for one principal reason, which is that their vulnerabilities are pretty high as well. Right? We're reaching a stage where I consider it to be mutually assured disruption, if you will, which is how you got to stick with you got a good acronym, stick with it, right? And then the second, of course, is that given kind of the integrated economies and things like that, that will happen if and only if I think we are also in a kinetic war. If we go to war over Taiwan, then all bets are off, right? And they'll be certainly targeting military command and control structures, and they'll be trying to cause us economic pain through the electric grid, and we will be doing the same. And I actually suspect that probably even in a kinetic war, both sides would self-limit to targeting military targets, command and control structures, things like that, because it would be very, very messy if we wind up I mean, if they turned off Los Angeles, we opened up the Three Gorges Dam, everybody would be ugly. So though the vulnerability and consequences are high, I think the risk itself is actually relatively low from China, where I think that we haven't really given enough thought. And one of the gentlemen around the table said he was from Special Operations Command, and I gave this talk actually down at Fort Bragg just last week, and said the exact same thing, is chaotic non-state actors, people with irrational motivations, who are, China fundamentally rational. We're not on their side, but they don't do just crazy stuff out of the blue. Non-state actors with ideological motivations, much more likely to do that. Their capabilities right now are much, much less than the Chinese. They probably could not exercise them against the electric grid in Los Angeles. However, that's a temporary state of affairs, a state of affairs that 5 years from now will be very different, because the capabilities are growing exponentially all the time amongst people of that ilk. So my biggest concern in this domain at that very, very catastrophic existential level is not from China, but that 5 years from now, some group that is the Earth Liberation Front and doesn't like nuclear power says that the real way to bring home the threat of nuclear power is to cause a meltdown in Calvert Cliffs, or some group that thinks that money is the root of all evil and that capitalism is bad, decides to put down the New York Stock Exchange for 2 weeks. Things that would have very, very significant impacts. I'm much more concerned about them on the long term than I am about China in the near term. Unless we go to war with China, in which case, there we go.
Thank you. One quick follow-up that made me, you mentioned something that made me think about this. Is China in any way connected to or involved with Anonymous?
Yes and no. The best evidence we have is that they are not involved in Anonymous in terms of directing it. But the other evidence that we've seen forensically all over the globe is that lots of state actors, China, Russia, Ukraine, slipstream behind them. And that a lot of things that Anonymous does provide cover for China, Russia, Ukraine, other bad actors, North Korea, Iran, quite a bit, to kind of follow in behind, mimic the techniques, do something slightly different. So while Anonymous is over here kind of doing a denial of service attack on Visa, which distracts the Visa's IT people, Iran comes in behind and drops some software that it leaves behind and then leaves. That sort of thing. So they are not fellow travelers, not generally taking direction, but they are unwitting accomplices, if you will.
I read an article this morning about intentional disruption of GPS systems.
Yes.
And the dramatic nature of what that would do, not necessarily militarily, but what it would do to the cities in terms of releasing crude oil into the rivers and smog and overall mayhem is pretty frightening to someone who doesn't understand this stuff. Seems to me that what you're talking about the non-state actors could come to play. How vulnerable are these systems to disruption?
GPS is a very weak signal that is easily spoofed and disrupted. If you want to go and see an example, go Google University of Texas at Austin Radio Lab drone spoof. And it'll come up with a video, and it's a GPS-controlled drone that they take over and crash. Actually, they don't crash it because they don't want to crash their own drone, but they make it drop down to just a few feet below the ground, and then they release it. It is relatively readily hackable, and therefore, to the extent that we are becoming increasingly dependent upon it for a host of services, a significant vulnerability. One of the things that I have written about related to this is the FAA's move to something called next-gen air traffic. Currently, air traffic travels across the United States from radar beacon to radar beacon. So you fly a flight path across the beacons. It's very safe, old school tech, also quite inefficient because you don't fly a direct path. You go from here to beacon A, then to beacon B, then to beacon C, and then down. Next gen, which will be an amazingly great thing in terms of efficiency, fuel saved, time saved, et cetera, billions and billions of dollars, is a plan by the FAA to transition all aviation air traffic control in the United States to GPS over the next 10 years. And when they first published this, there was the cybersecurity component of the plan was non-existent. They've gotten a little religion because a lot of people, and I wasn't the only one, said, come on, don't do that. And they said, oh, yeah, security, right, man? Got to do that. And so, again, to be determined whether they're successful. But the truth of the matter is that, at least in this domain for now, and anybody who works in it and has been at Cyber Command knows, attack beats defense every day and twice on Sunday, at least in part because the defenders have to be successful all the time and the attackers only have to be successful once. It's the same paradigm as with terrorism in a different space, and so it doesn't change very much. So we are approaching the possibility of a time when we can have a 9/11 hijacking without hijackers on the plane, which would be really an unfortunate result. That being said, we are, those who are responsible for the system are cognizant of the problem and are trying to do their best to harden it as much as they can.
One last here, George.
Hi, George Nicholson. Interesting that you were down at Bragg. General Mattis, the former CENTCOM commander, used to say what really concerned him is he says, I've got a bunch of Marines out there right now. They can't read maps. They say, why do I need to read a map? I've got a GPS.
Mm-hmm.
Admiral Zembrowski, who headed up the Office of Force Transformation, one of his favorite phrases was horizontal perturbation. And what he meant was, when you thought of the attack on the World Trade Center, it was catastrophic. But what was the horizontal perturbation? What did it do to the insurance industry? What did it do to the airline industry? So when you talk about what our adversaries can do out there, it's almost more effective not to destroy the system by GPS, but to force people to lose confidence in it.
We can degrade it, yeah.
Along the same lines, our ATM system. How many people in the room here right now have got more than $100 in their wallet? I don't have to worry about it. I'll just use my ATM card or I'll use my bank. You bring that system down and the impact. So there's some really larger concerns out there.
Well, I agree completely. The domain itself and our reliance upon cyber-connected world is becoming pervasive. And all of that is to the good. I mean, it really gives us much greater flexibility, efficiency. I can make a reservation for a restaurant in Paris for tomorrow night. And if I have the money to get there, I can get there. Today, there are more than 2.8 billion people connected to the network, over 1 trillion things. And it's the things that you're talking about, and it's going to only get more. I'll make some predictions for you. These are not China-related, but some predictions for you. The Internet of Things is moving towards driverless cars. We will see hacked driverless cars. The Internet of Things is moving towards chip-enabled Wi-Fi, Bluetooth programmable medical devices. My friend David has a new insulin pump that he programs with his iPad, which is great because he no longer has to go to the doctor. He no longer has to stick his finger. It's an immense benefit to him. And last year at a hacker convention in Las Vegas called DEF CON, 2 security researchers demonstrated that they could crack the security on that device and cause it to give a fatal dose of insulin. So not only is it this miracle medical device, it's an assassination tool. Every dependency creates vulnerability, and increasingly it's going to be exercised by people who have malevolent as well as beneficent intentions, and that's just inevitable. The only way to avoid this really is to not play the game. In cyber, we say that the only way to avoid being hacked is to not own a computer, or if you do own it, never turn it on. After that, all bets are off. And we could back up by requiring our troops to learn how to use maps and carry them with them. But that would mean that everybody's got to be issued a map, and they got to be up to date, and map reading has to come back in as a skill in Ranger School, and the whole 9 yards, and that's a cost. It maybe is a cost that we should bear as a matter of resiliency, but systematically we underinvest in resiliency factors like that across the globe, whether it's in business or in the military, because they're mostly costs that you hope never to actually gain the benefit of expending.
As a former submariner, in order to be qualified for your dolphins, you no longer have to learn to use a sextant. We don't do star navigation anymore, at least in the submarine force.
I will tell you, however, that I was happily on a Coast Guard vessel in Hawaii, and the quartermaster proudly told me that in order to get his quartermaster thing, he had to learn sextant, just in case his GPS went down. And I said, that's good, because it might go down.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're